I manage a backcountry outfitter shop in Boise. My professional life revolves around topography maps, weather-treated nylon, and water filtration. I understand the backcountry. It is an indifferent environment. If you twist your ankle 20 miles from a paved road, the mountain does not care. It will freeze you just the same. City guys view the wilderness as a playground. They buy expensive jackets, load coolers with beer, and treat the forest like a private tailgate. 3 years ago, I agreed to take a group from my old college dorm on a 3-day backpacking trip into the Sawtooth Range. There were 4 of us, myself, a guy named Joe, his roommate Dan, and Eli. Eli was out of his element. He showed up wearing pristine boots and carried a massive pack filled with unnecessary items, a heavy skillet, a lantern, a hardcover novel. Joe and Dan spent the first 5 miles making subtle jabs at him. I stayed at the front, setting the pace, keeping my silence. We established base camp around dusk. The location was a flat clearing ringed by ancient lodgepole pines, 12 miles from our parked vehicles. You could not get a cell signal if you climbed the tallest tree. As the sun dropped, the temperature plummeted. I built a modest fire. Joe and Dan immediately broke into their whiskey supply. By 10 o'clock, they were obnoxiously loud, totally oblivious to the sheer scale of the quiet surrounding us. Eli sat close to the flames, glancing constantly over his shoulder. The woods at night are imposing. The tree trunks absorb the firelight, creating a massive wall of dark timber that feels like it is pressing inward. Around 11, I kicked dirt over the embers, grinding the last of the glow into cold ash, and went to sleep. I woke up hours later. My watch read 2:40 a.m. I unzipped my sleeping bag and stepped out into the freezing air. The clearing was bathed in weak moonlight. Before I reached the tree line, an unnatural noise cut through the clearing. It was a woman weeping. The sound was sharp, echoing off the granite walls of the basin. It carried a strange, tinny resonance. I stopped walking, trying to figure out where the weeping was coming from. Women do not wander weeping through the high-elevation wilderness at 3 in the morning. The crying swelled in volume. It was originating from the dense brush directly behind Eli's tent. I watched the thin nylon wall of Eli's shelter bulge as he scrambled blindly inside. He was tearing at the zipper. A screamed plea for help erupted from the brush. The audio cracked slightly at the peak of the frequency. Eli burst out of his flap. He lacked shoes or a flashlight. His eyes were wide, reflecting the pale moonlight. He let out a raw shout of pure panic, stumbled over his guylines, and bolted directly into the thick, dark timber on the north edge of camp. He vanished into the brush in seconds. A burst of stifled laughter erupted from the center of the clearing. Joe and Dan were standing outside their dome tent. Joe held his smartphone, illuminated by the screen. The woman's screaming abruptly ceased. Dan choked on his own laughter, slapping his knee, boasting about the waterproof Bluetooth speaker they had hung from a branch behind Eli's tent. They had synced it to an audio file on a downloaded video to scare him. The amusement vanished when I explained the reality of the situation. A panicked man running blindly in the dark is a lethal liability in restricted wilderness. We grabbed our headlamps and stepped into the timber where Eli had broken through the undergrowth. Tracking in the dark is miserable work. We followed the snapped twigs and scuffed soil for 20 agonizing minutes, calling his name. Only the echo returned. We reached a small ravine cut deep into the hillside, its edges dropping off sharper than the terrain around it. From the bottom of the gorge, about 100 yards below us, the weeping started again. Dan let out a relieved sigh, assuming Eli had found the speaker and carried it down with him. I aimed my high-lumen beam down the steep slope and ordered Eli to turn the audio off. The crying did not stop. I picked my way down the incline, testing my footing on the loose dirt. Joe and Dan followed closely. At the base of the ravine, sitting on top of a moss-covered boulder, was the black Bluetooth speaker. The power indicator light was extinguished. The plastic casing was completely cracked from a heavy impact. It was destroyed, completely dead. I stared at the shattered plastic for a second too long. my throat going completely dry as it sank in. If the speaker was broken, the weeping echoing up the walls of the ravine was not originating from a digital driver. A frantic plea for help drifted out from the absolute absence of color just beyond my flashlight beam. It was exactly the same audio file, the identical pitch, the identical crack at the top of the frequency. But it was issuing from biological vocal cords, mimicking the recording with flawless precision. I raised my light, steadying my hand as I aimed the beam deeper into the ravine, trying to cut through the darkness below. Eli was huddled against the root system of an overturned fir tree. His clothes were torn. His bare feet were covered in dark mud and fresh blood. He was shivering violently, staring fixedly at the impenetrable wall of dark timber standing just 30 feet away. I hauled him to his feet, draping my flannel over his shoulders. I did not turn around. I slowly aimed the flashlight beam toward the trees Eli was watching. Standing just past the edge of the light, manipulating the shadows of the tree trunks, were two figures. Their proportions were entirely wrong. The limbs were elongated, draped in tattered material that blended perfectly with the rotting bark. One of the figures opened its mouth, drawing in a sharp, ragged breath that cut through the silence. Then a high-pitched wail followed, thin and piercing, rising unnaturally through the trees. It was projecting the crying audio directly at us. It was a hunting tactic: lure the prey with distress, disorient them with familiar sounds in an unfamiliar environment. I instructed Joe and Dan to walk backward, keeping their lights trained on the tree line. We began the agonizing retreat up the steep incline. Every time we took a step, the figures mirrored the distance, shifting through the brush with silent grace. They never stepped into the direct beam. They merely skimmed the edges, staying just out of focus. We broke the tree line and stumbled back into our campsite, the familiar clearing snapping into view as we pushed out of the dense, dark timber. I dragged Eli to my tent, grabbed my flare gun from my primary pack, and aimed it straight up through a gap in the canopy. The magnesium shell exploded into a blinding, searing sphere of crimson light. The weeping stopped instantly. I heard a heavy shifting of brush retreating deep into the forest. We broke camp under the dying red glow. We left the tents. We abandoned the gear. We strapped Eli's bloody feet into my spare shoes and walked the 12 miles back to the trailhead in a tight, silent formation. I still manage the outfitter shop. When city guys ask me what the greatest danger in the woods is, I tell them it's exposure. I do not tell them that nature has its own residents, and if you bring your foolish games into their territory, they will gladly show you how to play. If you hike long enough in the deep country, you learn a hard truth about human psychology. Society provides us with a comfortable buffer. We share food, we follow laws, we act polite. But strip away the cell service, drop the temperature below freezing, and introduce a real, tangible threat, and that buffer dissolves instantly. You find out exactly who a person is when their survival instincts override their loyalty, and I learned this the hard way 3 years ago. I was 24, working a monotonous office job in Seattle. My colleague, Ben, convinced me to use my vacation days for a late-autumn backpacking trip through the Olympic Peninsula. Ben was the experienced one. He owned the hiking maps, the high-end waterproof gear, and the bare canisters. I trusted his navigation. We drove 4 hours from the city, parked my sedan at a gravel trailhead, and hiked 7 miles deep into the temperate rainforest. The Olympic Peninsula is incredibly dense. It is a suffocating environment of ancient spruce trees, hanging moss, and ferns taller than a man. The canopy blocks out most of the sunlight, casting the forest floor in a perpetual, damp twilight. We established our site near a bend in a glacial river. The water was violently cold, rushing over slick stones. We ate rehydrated meals and hung our food bags high in a tree, exactly 50 yards downwind of our sleeping area, to avoid attracting scavengers. By 9 o'clock, the fatigue of the hike set in. We crawled into our shared 2-man tent. The nylon walls provided an illusion of security against the sprawling, hostile wilderness outside. We clicked our headlamps off. I am a light sleeper. Something woke me up, and I couldn't tell what it was. The steady noise of the rushing river was a constant background hum, making it difficult to tell one sound from another. The air inside the tent was bitterly cold. Ben lay asleep beside me, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythms. I lay on my foam pad, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. Over the rush of the water, I heard a heavy impact against the soil. It was a localized vibration. Something massive had stepped onto the earth near our site. I stopped breathing. The natural world does not announce itself loudly unless it lacks predators. Deer moved delicately, smaller game rustle through leaves. This sound possessed weight. A dry branch splintered. The noise was originating from the exact location of our suspended food bags. I nudged Ben. I jabbed my elbow sharply into his ribs. He woke with a start, inhaling quickly. Before he could speak, I clamped my hand over his mouth. I pointed a single finger toward the mesh door of the tent. We listened together. The sounds shifted closer. The heavy, unhurried footfalls abandoned the food cache and began moving toward the nylon walls of our shelter. It wasn't a bear. A bear investigates with grunts, tearing at fabric to locate a food source. This entity was silent, save for the massive weight of its steps. The footfalls ceased directly outside the thin wall of the tent, exactly where our heads were resting. I could hear a low, wet inhalation of air. The fabric of the tent bowed inward slightly, depressed by something leaning against the exterior. Ben scrambled backward, his sleeping bag tangled around his legs. The fabric zipper squealed in the quiet night. The entity outside reacted to the noise. A massive, closed fist struck the side of the tent. The fiberglass support poles snapped with the volume of a gunshot, a sharp crack that split through the night. The nylon roof collapsed, draping heavily over our heads. Complete, blinding panic erupted inside the shelter. Ben screamed. I kicked wildly at the fabric, trying to locate the zipper of the mesh door in the tangled mess. Through the chaos, I heard Ben successfully tear the zipper open. I felt a sudden rush of air flood into the collapsed structure. "Ben," I yelled, reaching out blindly in the dark. My hand brushed the nylon shell of his jacket just as he scrambled out of the opening. He did not grab my arm. He did not assist me with the tangled fabric. He hauled himself out into the freezing night, leaving me entirely trapped inside the collapsed fabric shell. I heard his boots slip on the damp river stones as he sprinted wildly in the opposite direction. I was alone, wrapped in a nylon shroud, lying on the ground next to whatever had just crushed the support beam of our shelter. I stopped struggling. If I moved, the fabric would rustle, drawing the attention of the threat. I lay perfectly still, pressing my face into the cold dirt floor of the tent. I listened to the heavy, wet breathing. The weight shifted on the earth. Slowly, the footfalls began to trace the perimeter of the collapsed tent. It was inspecting the wreckage. It walked a complete circle. It stopped again near my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting claws or hands to rip through the thin material at any second. Instead, a low, guttural vocalization vibrated through the ground. It sounded like an imitation of a human cough forced through a windpipe that was too large to properly shape the sound. The heavy steps pivoted. They did not move toward my position. They moved toward the river. It was following the sound trail of Ben's frantic splashing sprint through the river, each noise giving it a path to track him deeper into the dark. I remained trapped under that nylon material for 4 hours. I did not move a single muscle until the faint gray light of dawn illuminated the fabric. I carefully extracted myself from the wrecked shelter. The site was destroyed. The aluminum poles were twisted and sheared in half. I did not search the riverbank for Ben. I did not inspect the deep impressions left in the mud. I secured my boots, grabbed a single water bottle, and hiked the 7 miles back to the trailhead in a state of hyper-focused shock. I reached the gravel parking lot. My sedan was exactly where we left it, and Ben was sitting on the hood of the car. He was shivering, covered in dried mud, and staring blankly at the dirt. He had abandoned his pack, his coat, and his friend. He simply ran until his lungs burned, following the river down to the access road. He looked up when he heard my boots hit the gravel. He tried to speak. He tried to offer an excuse about seeking help, about panic overriding his brain. I didn't acknowledge his words. I unlocked the car, sat in the driver's seat, and waited for him to get in. We drove the 4 hours back to Seattle in absolute silence. I have not spoken to Ben since I dropped him at his apartment. We sever connections when trust is permanently broken. I still hike occasionally, but I hike alone. When you are alone, you know exactly what resources you have, and you understand the risk. The true danger of the wilderness isn't the wildlife. It is the false security of relying on someone else right up until the moment they leave you in the dark. I prefer the high desert. The air is entirely devoid of moisture, which means sounds travel with terrifying clarity. In the arid canyons of southern Utah, you can hear a rock tumble a quarter-mile away. It is an environment that rewards situational awareness. I am a freelance photographer. I specialize in night sky time lapses. My work requires severe isolation, steering clear of light pollution and paved highways. I travel solo in a modified Toyota Tacoma, equipped with an elevated rooftop tent. Sleeping off the ground offers a crucial psychological advantage. 2 years ago, I secured a permit for a remote expanse of BLM land near the edge of Capitol Reef. The terrain was a harsh labyrinth of red rock monoliths and dry riverbeds. I arrived at my coordinates an hour before sunset. The location was breathtaking, a vast, flat mesa surrounded by towering sandstone walls. I unpacked my gear, secured the aluminum ladder to my rooftop tent, and set up 2 tripods holding expensive DSLR cameras facing the eastern horizon. As darkness swallowed the canyon, the temperature dropped sharply, and the cold settled in fast across the open rock. I boiled water on a compact butane stove, ate my freeze-dried meal, and climbed into my elevated shelter. By 10 o'clock, the silence was absolute, just the vast, glittering expanse of the Milky Way rolling overhead. My cameras were programmed to trigger the shutter every 30 seconds, capturing the rotation of the Earth. Around 1 a.m., the natural silence of the desert shattered, breaking the stillness that had held over the canyon. It began as a low, mechanical rumble echoing off the canyon walls. I unzipped the mesh window of my tent and peered out. Headlights cut through the darkness on the valley floor below my mesa. 2 modified utility task vehicles, side by sides, were tearing up the dry riverbed, kicking up massive plumes of dust. The noise was aggressive, the high-pitched whine of revving engines mixed with loud, thumping bass from aftermarket speakers. I pulled my sleeping bag tight against my chest. The desert is massive. The odds of a recreational group randomly selecting my specific, isolated mesa to navigate were statistically 0. The vehicles did not bypass the incline. The headlights angled upward. They were climbing the rocky trail leading directly to my position. I zipped the mesh window shut. I grabbed my keys, a heavy steel mag light, and my canister of defensive bear spray. I sat cross-legged on the thin mattress, waiting. The engines cut off just 30 feet from my truck. The silence rushed back in, broken immediately by the heavy slam of metal doors and loud, slurred laughter. "Told you somebody was parked up here," a male voice shouted. The tone was thick, aggressively casual. I heard the unmistakable hiss of an aluminum beer can cracking open. There were at least 4 of them. I listened as heavy boots crunched over the loose gravel, circling my truck. They were assessing my setup. "Nice rig," a second voice noted, much closer to the base of my ladder. "California plates." "Hey, anyone home in the penthouse?" the first voice yelled. He slapped the side of my fiberglass truck cap. The impact shook the entire vehicle, causing my elevated tent to sway violently. I did not respond. Engaging with intoxicated groups in isolated areas is a critical mistake. If they realized I was a woman traveling alone, the dynamic would instantly shift from obnoxious curiosity to predatory confidence. "Check the cameras," a third voice suggested, his tone calmer than the others as he looked toward my setup. My heart stalled. My tripods were set up 50 yards away, holding $5,000 worth of glass and electronics. I listened to their boots trudge across the dirt toward my equipment. I grabbed my phone. The screen displayed exactly 0 bars of service. I was entirely on my own. "Look at this glass," the second voice marveled. I heard the loud, sharp clank of a tripod being forcefully dragged across the stone. "Hey, Ansel Adams," the first man yelled toward my truck. "You're trespassing on public land. Come down here and share a drink, or we start breaking lenses." They were escalating. I could feel it building in their voices and movements. They needed a reaction from me, something they could use to justify pushing things further. I gripped the handle of the bear spray. I visualized the descent. The ladder was narrow. If I climbed down, I would be vulnerable, my back exposed. If I remained in the tent, they could simply detach the ladder, trapping me on the roof. The footsteps marched back from the tripods, crunching steadily over the gravel as they returned toward my truck. "Maybe the truck is empty," a voice muttered, right beneath my floorboards, as if he were standing directly under me and looking up through the metal. A heavy hand gripped the aluminum rungs of my ladder. The metal creaked as a significant amount of weight was applied to the bottom step. He was climbing up. I did not scream. I crawled silently toward the entryway flap of the tent. I removed the safety clip from the bear spray canister. The suspension of the truck dipped as the man ascended the third rung. "Hello," he taunted in a mocking, sing-song cadence. I unzipped the fabric flap precisely 3 inches. I shoved the nozzle of the canister through the gap, pointing it downward into the dark, and depressed the trigger. A massive, pressurized cloud of atomized capsaicin erupted from the nozzle. The thick, orange fog blanketed the side of my truck, catching the man directly in the face before he could reach the upper landing. He shrieked. It was a raw, primal sound of absolute agony. He lost his grip on the ladder, tumbling backward into the gravel. Chaos ignited below. The other men shouted in confusion, coughing violently as the noxious cloud drifted across the campsite, burning their lungs. "She sprayed him. My eyes are burning. Get back in the rig." I did not hesitate. I unzipped the tent fully, vaulted down the ladder, and threw open the driver's side door of my truck. The man I had sprayed was writhing on the ground, clawing at his face, vomiting onto the dirt. The others were scrambling blindly toward their side-by-sides, entirely incapacitated by the chemical irritant hanging in the air. I slammed my door, locked it, and fired the engine. I threw the transmission into reverse, backing over a small patch of sagebrush to clear the area, and sped down the rocky incline. I left the tent behind without looking back. I left the tripods behind where they stood, abandoned in the dark desert. I drove for 2 hours on treacherous dirt roads until I hit the paved highway and cell service returned. I called the county sheriff, providing the exact GPS coordinates of my abandoned camp. The deputies recovered my gear the next morning. The group was gone, leaving behind empty cans and a patch of scorched earth where they had spun their tires. I still photograph and I still travel solo, but isolation is no longer something I rely on for safety. The quietest places on the map often attract people who seek spaces where their actions have absolutely no witnesses.